channel, so everything after this should be live.
Did you send me an opening script?
Yes, I did, but I can go ahead and read off that information and just do roll this morning. That would work.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so the meeting should be live now. And good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and begin the board meeting this morning for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. My name is David Fye. I'm the Executive Director for the BSRB, and we'll begin the meeting this morning with taking roll of board members and other individuals who are in attendance. Mary Jones.
Present.
Dave Anderson.
Present.
Jill Flessing. It looks like she's logging in through the Zoom waiting room, so she'll be in attendance here shortly. Linda Heitzman Powell.
Present.
Donna Honer-Quayle.
Present.
Jim Kilmartin.
Present.
Jacqueline Lightcap.
Here.
Richard Nobles.
Present.
Andrea Perdomo Morales.
Here.
Cynthia Schindel.
Present.
Laura Shaughnessy.
Present.
And David Stevens.
Here.
And then the following BSRB staff members are in attendance, and that is myself, David Fye, Executive Director, and then Tim Resner, Legal Counsel for the board, is also in attendance as well. And now I will read a short message, given that this meeting is being held remotely. So this is David Fye, Executive Director for the BSRB. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the board to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the Executive Director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment today to allow sufficient time for the board to discuss all items on the agenda. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely, I state for the record the following information. Access to this meeting is being conducted by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the through the use of the YouTube channel or on the conference call, which is currently live. While the meeting is being conducted remotely, the requirements of the KOMA are not suspended. As such, we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On February 1st, 2024, we sent notice of this board meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of such meetings. This notice was also posted on the board's website at ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda was posted on the board's website and is available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with a subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows members of the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And as I mentioned earlier, the conference call line is active, and there was no individual currently on the conference call line.
Thank you, David. The first item of business this morning is agenda approval. Everyone's seen the agenda that was attached in your packet. I'll take a motion to approve unless there's any changes.
So moved.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you very much. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed, same sign. Thank you. David, I'll hand it over to you for the discussion of legislative budget items.
Okay, thank you, Mary. And I think what I'll do today is I'll spend just a little bit of time sort of framing the budget process and then explaining the budget of the BSRB in a bit more detail, and then kind of talk about the item at hand, which is a recommendation from the House Budget Committee that reviewed the agency's budget this year. And I'll provide a little bit of historical information as we go through this process. First, what I'll do, I do have one document that I wanted to just share with you, and if you would like a copy of this afterwards, I can make it available to you. This will probably kind of help start the initial framing of the conversation. And this is a document that is from the Kansas Legislative Research Department. Every year, the Legislative Research Department gives briefings for members of the legislature that sit on budget committees or House Appropriations Committee, and they provide sort of an overview of the budget process. And I should also say that in terms of looking at the agency's budget, every board meeting that we have, I spend a little bit of time in terms of my executive director's report, providing an update in terms of the balance in the BSRB fee fund, which is our operating fund for the agency. I also give some information in terms of current revenue coming into the fund, expenditures from the fund, and then how that is affecting the ending balance. And so, and also kind of to frame this conversation today too as well, some of you on the board were board members when I was hired by the board back in 2020. But some of the board members have come on board after that point. And so I thought it might be helpful just to kind of share some of my background a little bit, which might become relevant in terms of the budget process as well. So I did attend Washburn University for my undergraduate with a bachelor's of art and political science, but then I went to Washburn School of Business and received a bachelor's of business administration in both economics and management, and then went to Washburn Law School and graduated, and I am a licensed attorney here in Kansas. But prior to coming over and working for the BSRB as executive director, I did work 8 years with the Kansas Legislative Research Department. The majority of time that I was there, I was a principal fiscal analyst, which meant that I staffed some of the main appropriations committees for the state. I staffed House Appropriations Committee as lead staff twice, Senate Ways and Means once, and then I also staffed a number of budget committees, like the Social Services Budget Committee. And during those years, what my role was is to review information that agencies submit for the budget process, summarize that information, and put that into a form for the legislature to be able to understand what the agency requested to spend money on, and then what the governor's recommendation for each agency's budget was, and then track changes during the legislative session as they worked with the major appropriations bill. And so, so I do have quite a bit of experience working in these areas, but the first time that I was actually putting together budgets was in my role as executive director for the BSRB. But to understand the budget process for the state, I think it's helpful to kind of see it as a bit of a circle. And so there's one place where maybe we can take a look at as a jumping on place, but it is helpful to think about it as it's always kind of moving. And so with this document that I'm sharing here today, this was a document from the Kansas Legislative Research Department. And I thought this might be a good place for us to start with this conversation just in terms of the state budget process. So first, in mid-September every year, every state agency is required by law to submit a revised budget estimate, and that is sent to the governor's division of the budget, or DOB, and also to the Kansas Legislative Research Department. And that has to do with the current state fiscal year, which we are currently in state fiscal year 2024, and also to submit a revised budget for state fiscal year 2025. So you always have the current year and then one additional budget year. For small agencies like us, we are referred to as biennial agencies. And so we are part of a group of about 30 agencies that every other year we have to submit 2 budget years into the future. And so this year we're just doing revisions to the already approved budget years. And so in September of last year, I did submit revised estimates for expenditures and also projections for revenue to the division of the budget. And then during that point, the governor's division of the budget and the governor's office reviews agency planned expenditures and revenue projections. And then in the beginning of January, the governor makes the State of the State address. And the following morning, the governor's recommendation for the overall state budget is presented, usually in a joint meeting of House Appropriations and Senate Ways and Means Committee. And during that presentation, they usually hit on, usually the governor's director of the budget talks about high-level items, but the governor has actually made recommendations on every specific agency budget in terms of the amounts that can be spent, any request for additional funding and things like that. And so in January, that did occur. The governor's recommendation did come out. And then there usually begins a process in February. This year, it actually started earlier than traditionally. And that is both the House and the Senate review and consider agency revised budgets separately. And so in the House, our budget is assigned to the House Higher Education Budget Committee, and members of that committee receive a presentation on the agency's revised budget estimate or request, and then the governor's recommendation. And in terms of the legislature's responsibilities, their starting point is generally the governor's recommendation. And so if you're wondering, why our budget is in the House Higher Education Budget Committee. There are a few different budget committees. There is one for social services. There is one for general government. There is one for agriculture. There's one for legislative agencies. There is one for K-12 budget. There's one for higher education budget. But given the number of health-related budgets, some of these don't always end up in the health committee. And for the last few years, even though we have a lot of similarities to, let's say, the Board of Nursing that is in the Social Services Budget Committee, our budget has been assigned to the Higher Education Budget Committee. And so we are one of the two fee-funded agencies reviewed by that budget committee with the Board of Healing Arts. But the vast majority of the work that budget committee does is reviewing higher education budgets. There's a couple other agencies in there, the State Library and Historical Society, that don't have a direct connection to higher education, but given the number of budgets, that has been the choice historically. And so that's why we're in the House Higher Education Budget Committee. And so the House Budget Committee meets, reviews the information. They begin usually with a presentation by the analyst from the Legislative Research Department, and then they hear from agency representatives that add additional information, and then they can ask questions of either individual, and then make comments. And then basically they make a recommendation to either concur with the governor's recommendation or to do something different. And they can make notes in their report as well, and they can request certain information. And so that's what the House does. And then once the Budget Committee has reached its determination, then that report is summarized, and the chair of that committee, it's a term called reports out, and that is here, report out in the Money Committee. And so the chair of that budget committee will report out the recommendations of the committee in the full House Appropriations Committee. And then that committee can make further changes, or it can concur with the budget committee's recommendation, or it can do something altogether different. And then on the Senate side, they do something similar. The budget is heard by a Senate committee. They can make recommendations, ask questions, and then it gets reported out by the chair or the chair designee to the full Senate Ways and Means Committee, and they can do something similar, concur, or they can do something different. And then ultimately the House has a position on every agency budget. The Senate does as well. Those are taken to the floor, usually in an appropriations bill, and voted on. And then both chambers come together in a conference committee to resolve items of difference. Usually there's a major appropriations bill, sometimes called the mega bill. And then later on in the year, they take a break for about 3 weeks, come back for the very end of session, which is generally called omnibus. And sometimes they can do additional budget information at that time too. And then sometimes there's a second omnibus budget bill. So I thought it may be helpful just to kind of explain how you walk through this process. And then it ends around May, sometimes as late as June. And then until the next year, agencies submit another budget in September. So that's the general budget process. Additionally, I included in your packet of materials a document that says Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board FY 2023 to FY 2025 budget analysis. And at the bottom, you see that it has the footer for the Legislative Research Department. I thought it might be interesting for you to kind of see the document that is provided by the Legislative Research Department. And so you can see what information is presented to those budget committees. It is currently in draft form while they are working on finalizing those documents, but that was what was presented to the budget committee for their review. So I wanted to include that for you as well. And that document does show how much the agency spent for actual expenditures in 2023. Additionally, how much the agency had projected as expenditures for FY 2024 and FY 2025. And I'm showing that document here now on your screen as well. They also indicate the number of full-time equivalent positions, or FTEs, and provide a little bit of the history of the agency. And then in their document as well, they go into some detail concerning what the agency recommended, what the governor's recommendation was. And one of the items I'll just call your attention to is on page 5. They do an overview of funding sources for agencies. And so they reviewed the agency's projected balance in the BSRB fee fund. And so you see here, based on expenditures that were projected and revenue that was estimated to come into the BSRB, it was estimated that over the course of fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 25, that the agency would be, the fee fund balance in the agency fee fund would be decreasing. And as we've talked about at other board meetings, we do operate currently at a deficit, and that deficit is by design by the board members. Board members did decide to lower certain fees several years ago, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit more. But I did want to show you the estimated decrease in the ending balance going down in these years. So that is the document from KLRD. And then, as I mentioned, the main reason for us meeting today for a special meeting has to do with a recommendation by the House Budget Committee. And so I'll share that document as well. As I mentioned, the House and the Senate consider the agency's budget separately. And you can kind of see here, we have the House Budget Committee report, and this was presented to the House Appropriations Committee. When the Budget Committee did consider the agency's budget, they did not have any differing position in terms of the amount of money to be spent by the agency in either fiscal year 24 or fiscal year 25. So you'll see here the agency estimate, the governor's recommendation, which also did concur with the amount the agency had requested. But what they did do is they made a recommendation to add a notation to the agency's budget. And it says here, the Budget Committee concurs with the governor's recommendation in FY 2024 with the following notation. Encourage the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board to consider utilizing their ending balance to reduce licensure fees and report their plan back to the House Higher Education Budget Committee by February 29th, 2024. And so that note was added to the Budget Committee's report in FY 2024 and also FY 2025. And this was reported out this past week on Wednesday, February 7th. Now, for reference, the Senate, when they considered the agency's budget, they asked questions about the ending balance, and they reviewed the information that was presented. And what they expressed in their budget committee was complimentary of the agency's efforts to reduce the ending balance. And they basically asked if the agency had the ability to raise fees whenever that was necessary to rebalance essentially the revenue coming in compared to the expenditures being made by the agency. And we did inform them that the caps are set in the statutes in terms of how much we can charge for certain fees, but the agency does have the ability to, when we would need to do so, the agency is able to go through and submit for an increase in fees at a certain point once the ending balance in the fee fund gets to a low enough amount. So the Senate committee did not make any further recommendations. They concurred with the governor's recommendation, and they actually were complimentary of some of the agency's efforts to save money by decreasing costs in different ways. And so their comments were largely positive on the Senate side. And then on Friday of this past week, the Senate Ways and Means Committee reported out the agency's budget, and there were no questions, and it went through smoothly. So you have a different position right now from the House and by the Senate. And so I think what next I'll do is I put together a chart that shows the ending balance in the BSRB fee fund year to year. And I tried to go back using some records for about 10 years so you can kind of see what has transpired with the ending balance in the fee fund. So sharing a document here now that looks back to state fiscal year 2016. And so basically looking back to state fiscal year 2016, the ending balance at the end of that year was about 1.3 million in the BSRB fee fund. But over the course of the next few years, the balance in the fee fund in 17 and 18 continued to climb by about $300,000 per year, up to a high in the end of fiscal year 19 of $2,275,000. And I can tell you, looking back at the history of the BSRB, some of the conversation by the board during this time was looking at different ways to possibly lower fees to try to decrease the growth of the ending balance in the fund. But there was also some concern. Several years back, there was something that the legislature would do occasionally at times where the budget process, where the state was struggling financially. They would, the term called sweep, they would take money out of fee-funded agencies' ending balances, and they would transfer it to the state general fund. And so I believe the board was going to move forward on a fee fund decrease in one of these years, and then the legislature transferred money from the fee fund, and so the board had to reevaluate what would be the appropriate amount. Now, following some of these fee fund sweeps, there was a pretty big lawsuit in the state of Kansas, and some agencies did sue the state of Kansas. And the state had to repay millions of dollars to these agencies. And so that process of sweeping money from fee fund balances has largely been frowned upon. But there is oversight to try to make sure that agencies are not charging more than they need to charge to the benefit of licensees, and to make sure they can still have operations. And so the board of the BSRB did implement pretty aggressive fee fund decreases back in 2019 that started to take effect in 20. We'll talk about those here in a second, and I'll show you those decreases. But starting at about 20, that's when those fee fund decreases, some as much as $50 decreases on certain fees, really started to show an effect. However, as you may recall, fiscal year 20 was not a normal year. That was the first year where the effects of the pandemic started to be felt. And I came on board towards the end of calendar year 20, so mostly in fiscal year 2021. But coming on board, some of you who were here, you may recall there were a series of executive orders from the governor's office during the pandemic, and that lasted from about March of 2020 through about May of 2021. And what those executive orders did is they basically prevented licensing boards like the BSRB from enforcing expiration of licensure. So individuals who normally would have been required to renew their license to continue to practice did not have to during that time period. So as you may imagine, revenue was fluctuating incredibly month to month. And so in an effort to make sure that these fee decreases did not drastically drop the ending balance of the fee fund during that time, one of the first things I did as executive director is I looked for additional savings, and we tried to count those that year to try to make sure that operations were balanced. And so one area of savings that was a bit unusual, there were no in-person meetings. So the money we would normally have for mileage reimbursement for board members attending board meetings and advisory committees, that was just something we didn't spend money on that year. Additionally, National Association conferences were canceled or largely moved online. And so any funding for board members or staff to attend some of those conferences did not occur. There was also less need to move forward on some planned projects at the time. There was some money in the budget to go ahead and start replacing board furniture. But given the fact that board members were not doing in-person meetings, we went ahead and delayed that into future years. And then there were also some choices to try to smooth out the cost. When I came on board, there was money in the budget to replace existing computers at the end of their warranty with new computers, but we decided to do leasing through the state's desktop as a service program. And by leasing it, we could spread the cost of those computers over the course of the life of those agreements. We didn't have to absorb that hit all right at once. But as we have moved past the state of the pandemic, some of our fees have returned to more of a normal amount. And so as you kind of look here at the end of the 2021, they had gone down. Largely, a lot of the effects of the pandemic had impacted revenue, but what also we had looked for savings too. And then in 22, the fee fund balance had gone up to about $2,155,000. And then we start to really see some of the decreases as of about December 31st, 2022. One of the other items that occurred around this time period is there was a bill that passed the legislature that basically would have added 2 more licensing specialists for the BSRB. That was the big bill that really affected operations last year, Senate Bill 131. And so at that time, I brought it to the board, and it was the board's recommendation to go ahead and absorb the cost of those licensing specialists without considering raising fees, at least for a couple of years, so we could see what the impact would be. And so currently right now, we have those recent fee decreases. We have the absorbing of the operating cost of the 2 individual people. And so over the most recent time period, it has gone down from 2.2. At the end of fiscal year 23, it was just a little under 2.1 million. And then just recently, as of December 31st, 2023, it is just a little over 2 million. And so this projected end of FY 2024 balance, that was what I had to put in given a number of unknowns back in September. And that was estimated to be about $1.7 or $1.8 million. And then at the end of FY 2025, it was estimated to be about 1.4 million. And then in the footnote there, I kind of highlight a number of those unknowns. So we have the continuing effect of the fee decreases. Also, the board did lower some temporary license fees additionally last year as well. So we're seeing the effect of some of those other fee decreases. We're absorbing the cost of those 2 licensing specialists. There's also an item that I'll kind of talk about in a little more detail too. We joined a compact for licensed psychologists called PsyPAC, and that became effective as of January 1st, 2022. All licensed psychologists renew in June of even numbered years. So we have seen the first impact for that group, but I think we'll really get more of a feel for how that will affect our license totals at the end of June of this year, 2024. So we'll probably know a lot more in July as far as how much PsyPAC is affecting our out-of-state licensees for psychology. Also, there's a professional counseling multi-state compact that we have joined that has not yet been implemented. So hard to know how that will impact our revenue for traditional licensure as well. And then we have a current compact for social work that will dramatically change state licensure should it be enacted, which I think it will. And then once it's all set up and working in different states, it would basically allow states to issue a multi-state license. And so as I've said before, we currently have about 8,288 licensed social workers in the state of Kansas. But of that amount, about 1,794 live out of state. And so that social work compact being enacted, there would be no reason for the out-of-state individuals to continue to get their license in Kansas. They would more likely choose a multi-state license in their home state. And so currently right now that bill is being considered by the legislature. And if there is no way for us to mitigate the loss of that revenue by charging more for that multi-state fee, then that would be an additional impact as well. So there's a number of unknown factors. So given what I was able to estimate at that time, and given the level of expenditures for the agency, these were the amounts in September. But I think looking at it now, given current projections and the implementation of those compacts, I think it will probably be a little bit higher at the end of each of those fiscal years. Also, some state agencies approach the legislature and ask for funding every year. The BSRB is a fee-funded agency, and so the BSRB does not ask for any money. By statute, we actually give up to $100,000. We give 10% of all revenue we collect to the state general fund. And so then what we're asking the legislature for each year is really a limit on how much we can spend in any given year. And so even if we have more money in the fund, we don't spend above that. We just spend whatever was in that limit. And so on paper, it looks like we will spend every dollar that we are budgeted. But I can tell you that once we have our limit established, I do try to seek out additional savings if we're able to do so. One of the areas that we have to budget for is that if we have cases where we deny licensure for someone and then they appeal it and then they get denied at the appeal level, it can go to district court, and those cases can become quite expensive. For disciplinary reasons, we can send some of those to the Office of Administrative Hearings, but if they continue to appeal those decisions, those can become quite costly as well. But if we don't have those expenses, then we don't need to spend them, and so we can avoid some of that cost. Additionally, for some of the out-of-state conferences, occasionally they make opportunities available for scholarships. We can never bank on that, but I usually do try to submit that information for board members if they attend those conferences to see if we can get some savings that way. There's also a number of fixed cost and variable costs. And so fixed costs have to do with things that we know how much we're going to spend, such as rent here in the state office building or salaries for employees. The variable costs are things where it could depend on how much we use something in a given year or the need to replace certain equipment. For example, we have a copy machine that we rent here, but we're charged based on how many copies we make. So it fluctuates year to year. There's also some other costs we have. We contract for legal services and we pay by the hour. And so depending upon how many hours we're billed, that can fluctuate as well. And we have a number of other things like postage and other things where it's just going to, change. And if we budget too low and then we run out of money, then we would be really in a difficult spot. So I hope to never spend as much as we fully have budgeted, but it is our best estimate for how much we will need if certain things should occur. So did kind of want to show you that ending balance in the fund as well. Also, one other factor I wanted to make you aware of, when the BSRB did put in some of those fee decreases, I'll show you what effect that had. So the board, like I said, did put into effect some fee decreases that started in FY 2020. And I'm showing you here on the screen sort of the main fees for the agency. There are some other smaller fees, but these are the main ones. And I would say those are application fees, original licensure fees, and renewal fees. And so as you can see here, for most of these, master level addiction counseling didn't really start until FY 2027 or 2017. But most of these fees were set, and then starting in FY 2020, the amounts for those fees were dropped by about $50 each. And so it was a pretty big decrease of those application fees, to decrease each one of those by $50. These are the original license fees. And so when someone applies for licensure, we work on all of their materials. If they do meet the qualifications for licensure, at that point, we charge them an original license fee. And these are the amounts there. These were not lowered as part of the fee decreases. It was just the application and the permanent renewal of licenses. And as I mentioned, you have the license renewal costs, and those amounts were almost all lowered by $50 back in 2020. The only one that was not was the behavior analyst license that was not reduced back in 2020. So that is what was done back in 2020. But something that I think is a factor the board should be aware of too in this process is looking at historical trends for licensure. Back when the board was considering fee adjustments and the impact of those fee adjustments, I show you here on the screen is the history of permanent licensure. If you look at the numbers between, let's say, 15 to 16 or 16 to 17, the rate of growth in licensees during most of that time period was around 2.5%, but no more than around 3%. But in the most recent years, the rate of growth for licensees has been closer to 4%. So while the fee fund decreases has had an effect, we've had more people applying for licensure, which is a good thing. There have been a lot of efforts in terms of workforce, but as we have more people applying for licensure, it means that there are more separate fees coming into the agency for revenue. So while the fees did decrease, they were kind of built on an estimation of about 2.5% rate of growth, and now we have about 4%. But whether that's going to continue or not, that's largely influenced by those multi-state compacts. And I think the rate of growth will decrease, which is something I've talked about in the last few meetings for the board. So I think the rate of growth in licensees will influence that. And then also the last document that I'll show you here, I did try to, in preparation for this meeting, give you an idea of how Kansas's fees can compare to other states. This is somewhat challenging. For some professions, it is very challenging. And part of this is because there's not perfect uniformity in terms of levels of license that are permanent between different states, or what individual states call a certain level of license. And so for the past week or week and a half, I've asked staff to sort of reprioritize their time. And I've had a lot of staff members work on gathering information on as many states as they could find. I have some good information, but I want more time to verify it and clarify it. So to the best of my knowledge, these numbers are true for the licensed psychology profession. And what I thought would make sense here to kind of show you is I've listed all 50 states, as well as their application fees for licensure. And if they have an original license fee, I've kind of combined these two as something I call entry fees, which is the application fee plus the original licensure fee. And I'll explain why I did that. And then if you look at licensure, I tried to normalize it so it would be the cost per year that they would be able to use this. Because, for example, let's say that some state has a $300 cost, but it's for a 3-year period of time. One that has a 100-year cost would seem like they have a lot better price point, but it's just relative to the number of years that you're actually receiving this for practice. So try to normalize it on a entry fee cost per year. And if you look at this for the licensed psychology profession, Kansas comes in right around 18th or 19th in terms of our entry level cost. You see some states don't have an original license fee. And I think to some people, they might say, well, that's good, We want to use this as a tool to help people come in and get licensed here. But what I will tell you is that I think it just depends on how you look at this, because basically there are some states that have only one fee, only an application fee, but their application fee is more than our combined application plus original licensure fee. And so what we do is we have an application fee, and then if someone meets the requirements for licensure, only at that point will we collect their original license fee of $50. For the states that only have an application fee, if let's say Rhode Island charges $230 and someone doesn't qualify for licensure, they're still keeping all $230. So us having two fees is actually to the benefit of the licensed applicant, because we're not collecting all that money if we can't issue them a license. We collect what we need to use staff time to check all their materials, and then if we can't issue them a license, then we have the original license fee. I mentioned we were around 18 or 19 in terms of those entry fees. In terms of our renewal fees, maybe somewhat surprising that based on what I was able to find, the renewal license cost per year for Kansas, for at least for the licensed psychology profession, is around $75. This is much lower than a number of other states. We are like the fifth most affordable state in terms of that price point. So, but the board lowered those fees knowing that that was not really sustainable over the long time, that they would be able to operate at a deficit for a while and then consider raising fees again once the balance in the fee fund had decreased. So I just am using one profession here. As I mentioned, I had staff try to run numbers for all the other professions, but I don't feel comfortable sharing all those with you at the moment, because even though they look pretty good and we don't seem to be an outlier in terms of being the state that is charging the most or anything like that, I just want to be able to give you good information. So to the best of my knowledge, I could vet these in a given time, but I think more time studying fees in other states is probably a good approach before we start to throw numbers out there. So I wanted to kind of frame some of those topics for you. The question, I guess, today is, given the House Budget Committee's recommendation, and just to remind you that recommendation, it was to encourage the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board to consider utilizing their ending balance to reduce licensure fees and report their plan back to the House Higher Education Budget Committee by February 29th, 2024. So the House has taken that position, the Senate has not. And when you have the House and the Senate with different positions, it does kind of put agencies into a challenging position. I do think that we will know more information after June. Once all the licensed psychologists renew, we'll have some better information as far as that SIPAC compact. I do think right now, given the ending balance in the fee fund, we could lower some additional fees. Now, the implications of that is that if the board wanted to reduce fees even further, since we're already operating at a deficit, it means that the length of time where we would have to come back and raise fees ultimately would be shortened. So we would have to come back and raise fees in a shorter period of time. But given all the factors that I've mentioned today, I do think that there is some room in there if the board wanted to decrease fees. And I think one of the fees that has been talked about is that original licensure fee. I have run some numbers to see what it would be if that original licensure fee was completely removed, and that would really, really hurt the agency's budget. But just some options that you have on the table. You could put forward a recommendation today to decrease fees. You could put forward a recommendation to study these topics in more detail and submit something in the fall with the budget request next year when more of these are known. The ask of me right now is to put forward a report to that budget committee by February 29th, 2024. Now, they requested a plan to reduce fees, but I wanted you to be aware of all the factors and why it's hard right now when we don't have full information on the impact of some of these compacts and other items as well. I can tell you that recommendation for the report was not from the chair of the budget committee or from the vice chair. The recommendation for the report back on lowering fees was made by the ranking minority member of the committee, but it was made after a period of discussion by the committee. There were some other possible recommendations that were discussed. One member of the committee had talked about possibly taking half the balance in the BSRB fee fund and separating it into a separate account and not allowing the agency to spend money using that amount, but to instead put it towards lowering fees. I think if something like that did occur, it would really jeopardize our operations because we do have cash flow that comes in that does vary quite a bit month to month. So I think something like that, we would really need to speak to the legislature and ask them to remove a recommendation like that. But I think that there is some input from members of the legislature to look at our fee fund balance and to see if we can lower fees. So I wanted to just bring all this to you and then see if you had any comments or questions or some discussion today.
I have a question. Was there and this may be tied up in what you just said, was there a particular reason as to why there was a recommendation to reduce fee fund, the ending balance?
So the balance, so our budget right now is about 1.1 to $1.2 million per year, and that's how much we spend every year. The balance in the fee fund is just a little over $2 million. And we had informed them that we operated a deficit by design. The balance will be going down every year, maybe even more so depending upon the impact of these compacts. We were the only agency, to my knowledge, that received a notation like this. But we're also only one of 2 fee-funded agencies before that budget committee. So, you know, in terms of why we were specifically the agency that was highlighted here, I think there were some questions by House Appropriations that also raised an eyebrow that asked, you know, why the BSRB was receiving this recommendation given the deficit. And so, yeah, that's what I can share. It did seem a little unusual, and to my knowledge, I don't think a lot of other agencies have received a similar recommendation. So.
David, I think it's interesting that the state is looking at our funds when they've got billions of dollars sitting out there themselves. However, I also think it's responsible for us to respond in such a way that we're looking at that and we'll consider it for the budget year 2024. Especially with the compacts potentially coming and being uncertain of the impact compacts will have on our revenues. And I think also the psychiatrist's new way of licensure coming in will give us a better footing and foundation to make better educated recommendations.
And I did want
Yeah,
to
I also wonder too, like as part of this conversation, you know, do we feel like we have adequate staffing to manage? If you've got 4%, if we now have increased our licensees to this level, I mean, do we need to be looking at personnel too as the total picture of what's happening? You know, do we need more people who can be licensing specialists or even investigative specialists? Are there things that we need, you know, in total? Funds, the fees, just part of it, but are there other things that, you know, from a capacity standpoint, we should be looking at if we're seeing these increases? And again, just like the comment Jim made, not knowing what the impact of these interstate compacts will bring for us as well.
And to Mary's point and to Jim's point, we have just added the community-based licenses to our jurisdiction, and we don't know the degree to which there will be growth with those licenses because we just added those licenses in the last fiscal. So I think that we need to further examine that impact and the impact it will have on what Mary was just referencing, the investigative specialists and our licensing specialists.
you know, and to that point with the multi-state compacts, you know, we've talked about our revenue and how that could be affected. One other item we've talked about is the requirement of getting background checks with fingerprinting. And that is also a variable that probably is part of this discussion too, because we honestly don't know how much additional staff time that is going to take once we start doing these background checks and asking staff to review all this information. And I can also see that if we're doing a lot more background checks on individuals, I think it's just a numbers game that we're probably going to find things and have certain additional complaints against practitioners by finding things that they did not report. And that is going to be some additional time for our investigators too. But without having any frame of reference, it's hard to know how much that's going to affect staff time.
I think there's just too much in flux at this point.
I agree.
To make a change in the fee structure. And so if I would want the plan to be that you present to them that we will be monitoring all of these factors and present a possible plan for reduced fees with the fall budget.
I agree. I think it's important to respond to what they have brought up. I mean, these are, important issues for legislators. And when they say those kind of things, what we know from the past is if we don't address those and they feel like we're not listening to them, then they just kind of create their own solutions.
Mhm.
And sometimes that creates more problems for us. So I think, going back to Jim's point, if we submit something to them, we make sure that we address those concerns really in as much detail as we can in terms of why we're doing what we're doing.
So this is Linda, and I'm not really sure how this whole process works. But when I look at the 3A4, the history, the one profession that did not have a fee decrease in 2020 was the behavior analyst sector. So I don't know if I agree with what everybody's saying. There's just not enough information, especially with the multi-state compacts. I mean, we really don't have enough information at this point in time. So I don't know if we throw them a bone and say, in reviewing this, the one area that we could potentially look at in the short term is the behavior analyst category, because there was no change and there was no fee decrease for them. I don't know. Is that?
There's such a small number.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
It would
It's
have very little impact.
That's sort of what my point is. It's a small number. It would have very little impact, but it would be showing them that we're looking at the fee structure, right?
Yep.
So I don't know. Just a thought.
David, I have a question. What is the process when you add another employee at the BSRB staff?
So there is, there used to be a limit on the number of full-time equivalent positions per agency, but that was done away with some time ago, at least 10 years ago. Right now, the way that it is controlled is through the budget, how much money you're appropriated to spend. And so basically, what we would do if we needed to add additional staff, we could make a recommendation or make a request in the budget when we submit it in September of next year for a certain amount. And then if that would exceed our existing balance, then we would just ask for an increase in our expenditure limitation. From a practical standpoint, it's much more complicated. You have to define a position description and write that up, advertise a position, hope that you get enough people to apply for the position, that you have good candidates, and then you hire that person. Right now, we are somewhat locked in terms of available space here at the BSRB office. So we currently have a shared office between two people. We have another person who has a temporary setup in the boardroom while we're trying to go through and clear files from our file room to give more space. And so logistically, it's challenging, not to mention, doing getting them new equipment like a laptop or any kind of a setup. And so it can be done. I do think with the investigators, if we were to need another investigator or someone to help with that process, it might be easier. Our investigators do some of their work remotely, which has allowed us to do the shared office for our investigators. But it is a complicated process. And right now, we in the current budget request, we did a request to convert a half-time position to a full-time position to help out with some of the licensing responsibilities, but that has nothing to do with any kind of investigative work or anything like that. And that was kind of based on what we're already working with under the existing parameters. So
I think that's
What
also an
about-
important point. Oh, sorry, David, go ahead.
I just had a quick question about, in terms of, the other primary issue we hear a lot about is that our process takes a long time and that we don't have an ability really to track data as well as we'd like to be able to. What about, is there a way for us to use some of this funding to do something in that area so that we have better data, so that when these issues come up, instead of our saying no, most people get through quickly, we can actually provide really, really good and accurate data to legislators about that issue?
yeah, Dave, I appreciate you bringing that up. There was a bill that passed last year that, among other things, created an enterprise licensing system for state agencies with some additional tools for tracking information. The board was going to hear a presentation by that entity called Acela at the January board meeting, but they were unable to present at that time. So I kind of talked about it briefly, but they should be able to present information on another option at the March board meeting. And I do think some of their tools would be helpful in terms of integrating processes and making things more efficient. It does sound like there would be about a $200,000 implementation cost of moving to a new system. But right now we're unsure if that could potentially be something that we would have to absorb within our cost, or something that potentially we could use some pandemic related money for. But if it's something that we would need to absorb, and the board decides that would be something the board would want us to move towards, it would be important that we would have that money available for absorbing that one-time cost as well. So
I think that's a really good point. And I think where I'm putting all the pieces together. I mean, I've heard you speak about facility limits, and we have technology limits. We have some things we need to implement that are big ticket items. Just responding by saying we'll reduce fees seems pretty short-sighted in the grand scheme of all of these issues. And I think from my standpoint, I'd feel more comfortable saying, yes, we are open to evaluating what a reduction in fee would look like. And even those initial application fees, in my mind, as I was looking at the charts, maybe seemed like a place where we could target because they were a little bit higher than other states. But I think I would feel more comfortable saying, yes, we're going to look at this. Yes, we're going to continue to talk about it. And by maybe mid-year, we'd have a better sense of what all of these needs are, including facility, technology, staffing, to see if there are enough substantial changes before we make another change to fees.
I agree
Well
with that.
stated.
Back to, I think what Linda said is, if there's a group that we didn't reduce, it makes sense. And it seems like, I think, to use her phrase, throw them a bone, it was, here is a group
Completely agree.
done that best, so let's, and if it doesn't have a huge fiscal impact, it makes sense to do that as well.
Completely agree.
I agree.
So in the past, when those fees were decreased, it looks like they were decreased by about $50 each. And those license renewal fees for assistant behavior analysts and license renewal fees for behavior analysts were not lowered. So would it be a recommendation to essentially lower each of those fees by $50, which would be the same as the other fee reductions?
Yes.
Okay.
Do we need a motion?
You need a motion?
It's always cleaner to do
moved.
it. Okay.
I'll second that.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, same sign? Great. And I think, Dave, do you need a motion on sort of, I think we are in agreement. There's a consensus around how we'd like to respond. This will be one step in that, but also the talking points around why we need some further evaluation on the fee fund balance. But do you need a motion on that, or do we think we've captured that from everyone here?
Let me take a shot with a statement, and I'll also bring from your comments during the meeting today.
Okay.
But seems like there's a consensus by the board to respond back to the report, to let them know that essentially the board did hear their message and understands the concerns about fee the fees, but wants to collect more information on fee amounts in other states, and also the needs of the agency concerning operations and licensing and timeframes and available resources with staffing, potentially also with investigations, and wants to collect more information in terms of the possible impact of these multi-state compacts. And the board believes it should have better information prior to the agency submitting its next revised budget request in September, and can submit additional items at that point based on the information that has been collected. Is that pretty fair?
It's pretty close. Thank you.
Okay.
David, I have one more question quickly. What compacts we have enough data on by then to really base our projections on? Because counseling won't even be happening.
Right. I think for the SIPAC compact, that one is one of the biggest ones. It
Okay.
became effective in Kansas on January 1st, 2022. And that was basically, 6 months time between all those psychologists who had to renew their licenses. So I don't think we really felt the full impact of what SIPAC is going to mean in terms of our licensure for that profession. So we should know more information after that. Also, knowing that House Bill 2484, the social work, we should have information by that point whether it's going to pass. And then if it does pass, if it is going to include the flexibility for us to be able to charge more for a multi-state license. If we can't, we know that we're going to have to absorb an additional about $150,000 loss in revenue every 2 years because of that. So being able to balance that out could impact ability to decrease fees in other areas if that's an opportunity. So.
We might be able to glean some information from other states too, potentially. I think that what they're seeing, who've been in it longer.
Mhm.
The social work compact hasn't started yet. That one is brand new.
No, I meant for SIPAC, sorry.
For SIPAC.
I wasn't very clear. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Any other business, David? Did we cover what we needed to today?
Yes, and I appreciate you meeting, especially with such short notice. We wanted to be responsive to the budget committee and their recommendation, but there's also, talking about the budget, you can really get into the weeds, and the history is really important, but appreciate your time this morning. But I think this is enough information for me to put together that report. And when I provide it to the budget committee, I will also make sure that I provide a copy to the members of the board as well, so you can see what information goes back to the committee.
Thank you so much, David.
Were we going to take action on I don't know that anyone actually made the motion, Dave, that you had recited a little bit ago.
So the board can do the consensus, or they can take a motion, but it is always cleaner to do a vote. So
I make a motion.
Thanks,
second
Laura. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today, and I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And we will, I'll see some of you very soon.
See some of you very soon.
thank you, everyone.
Bye.
That's fun.